had been sent in 1891 with a small party of Prussian foresters into the ancient stand of the Białowieża forest, after villagers swore they had seen what they called a pale forest man. We arrived by horse-drawn cart under low autumn light and found warnings pinned to cottage doors. From the first mile, the trees closed like a wall, and an unease took hold, as though the woods themselves were watching us. We were a party of 4, 2 state foresters in regulation overcoats, the district game warden, stern, with a voice that never lost its official rasp, and myself, a surveying clerk tasked with recording bearings and particulars. Our kit was not theatrical, but exact. A triangulation theodolite wrapped in oiled canvas. A pocket chronometer set each morning to the church bell at dawn. A sextant for river bearings. Leather-bound maps annotated in iron-grey ink. A bolt-action Mauser rifle lashed to the cart side. 2 axes, and a dry plate camera whose wood and brass box rattled in its crate. We carried candles and tins of preserved meat, a coil of hemp rope, and a handful of tobacco for the cold evenings. The retired hunter's notes were folded in my breast pocket, shaky pencil tracings of tracks, a few measured paces, and a margin in which he had scrawled, in a hand shrunken by years, "We chased it into the old grove. It would not show itself." We followed a poorly kept cart track that sank in places into the leaf mold, and a series of timber stakes, freshly cut, their tops blanched by the wind, that marked the line of a recently measured boundary. The cart's wheels left the only clear scars upon a floor of brown leaves and cones. Horses snorted and stamped. Their breath hung white in the thin air. Low autumn sun came through the canopy in anemic bars, and the light that passed was the color of old bone. The woods smelled of wet bark and the metallic tang of decaying beech leaves. Occasionally, a jay cried, startled and impatient, and the sound flapped away into the dark green. We set the theodolite twice that day, first upon a small rise beside a birch, where the hunter's notes indicated a fresh clearing, and later on, a stump ringed with lichen. The foresters measured with quiet competence. Angles called aloud, cross-staff used to pace, my hand steady upon the chronometer as I took times for azimuth. At noon, we ate cold bread beneath a leaning spruce, while the warden tautened the Mauser's bolt and checked the oil. I lashed a dry plate into the camera and exposed a single glass negative of the track where the hunter had said he lost sight of the thing. The plate's surface caught only the ordered geometry of trunks and a spill of light. The camera's shutter made a small mechanical breath that seemed obscene in that hush. Cottages near the forest's edge bore the first traces of alarm. Strips of cloth knotted to lintels, hastily written scraps tacked to doors, a child's shoe hung by a cord. The notices were formal enough. Requests to avoid the wood, pleas not to hunt at, night. But some carried superstitions in their margins, crosses of chalk, the smear of salt, the image of a closed eye. Villagers would not meet our gaze when we questioned them. One woman, her hands raw from washing, pressed a hand to her mouth and whispered of a figure pale as the inside of a bone, moving without sound between the trunks. Her neighbors crossed themselves. The warden in his coat folded his hands and muttered that superstition might be the veil of fear. But when he spoke, his eyes roamed beneath the brows, searching the shadow where tree met tree. As we moved inland, the air cooled. The track dwindled. Timber stakes became sparser, then stopped altogether. Our compass needle spun a steady truth in my palm as we set our course by the retired hunter's notes. 200 paces northwest from the hollow oak, then crossed the marsh toward the twin pines. But the forest shifted around us, making compass and map feel brittle. A sound, which I could not name, whether the long scrape of something moving across bark or the settling of distant limbs, kept time with our steps. Once, beside a fallen trunk, we found faint impressions in moss, long, narrow, and paler than the sod around them, as if something had lain in the wet and drained the colour from the earth. The foresters exchanged a look. The warden removed his hat and stood silent as the light slid away. We made camp before dusk under a denser stand of oaks. We set a watch, stoked embers, and recorded our bearings. The dry plate stayed unexposed, waiting for a subject we did not yet claim to understand. I wrote in my journal by candlelight, the words small and deliberate, because writing steadied the hand as much as the chronometer steadied the hour. The forest was full of small, patient noises, the tick of beetles, the whisper of lichen, a distant hoof-fall that might have been deer. Outside the circle of our embers, something moved that was neither beast nor holy wind. We were a measured company of men trained to read wood and soil still. That night, none of us slept easily. The path ahead narrowed to a green throat of trunks, and the retired hunter's penciled line drew us onward into a deeper, older wood. The forest was older than any of our maps suggested. Moss-encased oaks and hornbeams rose like pillars, while mist pooled in the hollows, and the air tasted of peat and rot, dulling sound and light. Villagers along the route had wearily told us not to camp near a particular glade. They muttered of stock unsettled at night, and hounds that would not bay, and when we approached that quadrant, even the birds fell silent, and our compass needle trembled for a breath. We were a small commission from the Königsberg Forstamt. Myself, designated for measurement and report Oberförster Heinrich Müller, broad-shouldered and not a man to yield to fancier surveyor with a planetable and box of drawing instruments. 2 local woodsmen, Jakob and Thomas, who knew the deer paths by heart, and a sergeant of the Beit. Gendarmerie with a short carbine and a stout lamp. We travelled light for a survey. Canvas tents, a barometer and pocket chronometer, a brass prismatic compass, lengths of chain and cord, axes, spirit lamp and kettle, tins of salted meat and black bread, tobacco, and a small bottle of surgical alcohol. Our boots were hobnailed, our greatcoats thick with the October damp. The maps we carried bore inked notations, tracks, drains, names long since altered, and yet they betrayed nothing of the hollows we entered. The route took us first along a frozen stream, then up through alderbog, where our boots sank past the ankle and the mosquitoes had long surrendered to the cold. We measured angles at the old boundary stone and noted lichen growths. Müller kept his temper by routine: check the chain, set the planetable, make a datum. When the trees closed, we lashed the compass to the planetable and used the pole to sound peat depth. The needle wavered more than once, as if some unseen hand had brushed near the brass. The men felt it in their bodies, heads light, a weight behind the eyes. And when I paused to sketch the trunk of an ancient oak, I noticed the skin upon my fingers was white from the chill, though my breath did not yet cloud. At the edge of the glade, the air altered. The green carpet gave way to a ring of flattened heather and a stand of beech whose trunks shone as if dusted with flour. Here the cattle had been driven away, hoofprints tracked in a wide arc. Aside them, long impressions like footprints, but without the clear impression of heel or sole. Jacob crouched and ran his hand through the sunken furrows. "Not a boar," he said, voice low, more used to naming creatures than naming absence. Thomas found hair upon a bramble, a pallid, almost translucent fibre which the sergeant wrapped in paper and handed to me for preservation. It had not the coarseness of wolf, nor the fine sheen of hair. It caught the weak light and seemed, briefly, to glow. We made camp at the tree line, unwilling to enter the glade at night, but unwilling too to quit before we had evening observations. The men tended the fire, boiling our coffee on a spirit lamp, parceling the cold meat and examining the supply of cartridges. I recorded our bearings by chronometer and the angle of the ridgeline. Müller paced the perimeter with his lamp, eyes to the dark, and once he returned to me and spoke only to steady his hand. "There is a silence here that presses," he said. "It is not the forest's sleep." Night held with a wet fog that pressed the flame into a dull halo. Once, well after midnight, I was roused by a slight movement against the tent wall and the muted sound of branches parting at the edge of the firelight. The sergeant reached for his carbine. Jacob closed his teeth upon a curse, and Thomas moved to stand with his axe. We unpinned the flap and peered out. Beyond the light, a shape stood upright between two beeches, no taller than a man, but not of the same breadth its skin, if skin was. The word caught the lamp and seemed pallid as new sapwood. It held itself motionless, as if considering us, then tilted its head with a small human articulation. Before any of us could speak, it moved with a speed that belied its limbs, slipping back into the gloom and leaving behind, where its feet had been, the faintest mark upon the earth and the smell of wet lime. In the morning, we found that a young sapling had been bent and broken, its bark scraped as if by fingernails, slender and wet. The hair we had gathered lay upon my table that night under paper and wax, and the compass would not, for some hours afterwards, still itself. We did not sleep in the glade. We debated our course by the weak light of dawn, to withdraw and report, or to push farther in while the men were whole and the day young. Müller looked at our instruments, at the broken sapling, at the pale print, and then at each of us in turn. He did not allow superstition, nor did he wish to be mocked before the ministry. He said only, "We were sent to learn. We shall go in at first light." We broke camp, packed the planetable and chain, and readied our boots. The forest closed around us once more, and as we entered the beech ring, a hush settled that felt less like absence than expectation. We began to find anomalies, elongated, shallow depressions in the leaf litter, too large for a man but lacking a clear hoof or claw impression, strips of pale, fibrous material caught on young saplings, and bark freshly peeled in long, human-like strokes. A survey stake we had driven at noon was found snapped and tossed 20 paces downhill. I set down my chain and knelt to measure one of those depressions with the surveyor's rule. It exceeded the length of a boot by a full span and lay shallow, as if whatever had made it had pressed weight without the sharpness of a foot. The men exchanged glances. Herr Kraus, our photographer, spat once and wiped his hands on his trousers with the deliberation of a man who had seen rotten wood and wolf prints in 100 forests, but not this. The pale fibers on the saplings were not wood dust. Under my fingers they felt like the inner layers of bark, fibrous and stringy as linen that had been pared away in long strokes, not torn. I pried one ribbon free with my knife, and it held together in a hanging sheath, glistening faintly with moisture. The scent was close to sap, and damp hair it settled in the nostrils in the way of old cellars and animal lairs, not of freshly broken timber. When we held it to the light, the filaments refracted like pale threads. We took measurements. This commission kept exact records the foresters demanded numbers where superstition might otherwise grow. I wrote by lantern in the field book 2 depressions, 40 and 42 centimeters in length. Pale strands adhered to saplings at heights between 1 and 1.5 meters bark, stripped in strokes averaging 30 to 40 centimeters, parallel and deliberate. The stake, the noon stake, lay 20 paces below where I had set it, snapped at the head and lacerated along the shaft as if bitten or gripped and flung. The head of the iron mallet we used for driving the peg had fresh marks, as though the stroke had met resistance, not of stone, but of living hold. Herr Kraus showed me his last exposed glass plate beneath the ground glass. He had used a heavy tripod, and our wet plate apparatus, collodion, was still the habit of exacting photographers, though dry plates had come into use, because the dampness of the wood had not permitted long exposures without haze. The plate bore a smear of the pale, fibrous substance across its emulsion, a faint, almost comical white arc, like a ghost of hair. The negative, when he held it up to the dim winter light, rendered nothing but a fog where his subject should have lain. He swore softly in the old country way, and remarked that the plate had been clear when he took it from the dark box at noon. The day fell early. A dampness crept through our garments, the kind that finds seams and refuses to be shaken out until a stove is affordable. We moved with lanterns and the poor light of a sun that had already passed behind the eastern ridges. There came, as the evening thickened and the long shadows lengthened, a sound I had no ledger for, a low, windless groan that rolled through the trunks like a great hinge settling. It had no source we could see, no throat opened among the branches, no wolf answered, and yet it resonated along the bole of the trees as if the wood itself uttered it. We set watches. Weber, the commission's senior, clasped his hands round his pipe and sent 2 men to the ridge with instructions to mark the course with a panel of white cloth. I ordered the rifle shouldered, though none of us wished to fire unless nature demanded the muskets and single-barrel rifles kept in the pack were instruments of last resort, and we respected their noise for what it would call to such a place at dusk. The men tied strips of cloth to the marked trees and drove new stakes, where we judged the pale trail led, yet morn revealed another of those new stakes broken. Its splinter pointed downhill as though something had struck it from above. Night fell without the usual chorus of owls or foxes. Even the wood's small sounds, the tick of beetles, the rustle of leaf, seemed diminished. Only that groan returned twice more, each time nearer, once compelling the dogs to whine in their leashes, and once so close that the hair at the base of my neck prickled with the sensation of being observed. We took to moving with greater care, lanterns canted low, boots muffled with spare cloth. Each new discovery, the pale strand snagged upon a young sapling, the strip of bark laid neatly aside, tightened a knot of attention among us. The commission's route led deeper into that thin afternoon, and into a question we had not expected to answer by measurement alone. We followed. We had been commissioned by the Königliches Forstamt in the spring of 1891 to survey a tract of oak and beech on the eastern verge of the county. Our route was a narrow deer run that led from the cart track to a small pool the hunters named the White Hollow. By the second evening, as the light went thin, we followed that hollow with lanterns stowed and our Mauser rifles loose in hand. The air sat cold and green with the smell of sap and wet leaves. My boots sank an inch in the loam, and the field glass at my breast fogged when I raised it. It stepped into the last light then, tall, gaunt against the bole of an old oak, the skin ashen where the bark behind it gathered black, hair tangled and matted with lichen. It stood straighter than any beast I had seen, and it moved with a deliberation that was not haste, but a patience older than hunger. We halted. I felt the leather of my cartridge box press against my hip. I remember the particular sound of the lock as it clicked when my companion checked his Mauser, the smell of oiled steel and tobacco. We called, an ordinary call, meant to warn and to put an unknown thing to flight. The creature did not run. It cocked that long head, and pale eyes shone like glass held to the lantern light. There was, to this day, the memory of a footfall softer than moss, and then it slipped between trunks as a shadow might be folded away, leaving only the sense of height and pallor and a single faint echo of movement. We tracked it for a distance by impressions in the loam and by the snapping of twigs at shoulder height. The marks were not like a man's boot. They spoke of long stride and light pressure. No complete prints, only the disruption of leaf mat and a brushing of young saplings as if some lank limb had passed through. Once we found a strip of bark shorn clean at about 6 feet off the ground. A smear of grey hair lay beneath it, clinging to resin. My fingers came away sticky and smelling of wood smoke. Night closed around us. We made camp with the care of men who had seen more than wolves. The tent pegs were hammered deep, the kerosene lanterns set low, and we spread the salted pork and black bread on our knees. I set down my field journal, linen pages, ink and a stub of a pencil, and made notes of the bearing taken by compass, south by southeast, 340 paces from the pool. Beyond practical work, there were small human gestures. A shared cigarette my companion lit with trembling fingers, the recalcitrant sparking of a tinderbox, the mending of a torn gaiter by the light of the lantern. We refused, between us, to give voice to what we had seen. At midnight, a sound came that was not wind, nor the ordinary small creatures of the wood. It arrived like a negotiation, a careful foot over dry leaves, a soft pad that made the canvas of the tent shiver. One of our hounds, which had kept a nervous vigil, lifted its muzzle and whined, then fell silent as if the sound itself had stilled it. We sat with palms on our rifles, breath shallow, counting the rounds among us as if that act could conjure safety. Once, the tent wall dimmed as something large passed within a yard of the flame, a faint knocking of branches set like fingers in the dark. We issued from the tent at a prearranged signal, 2 men to each flank, lanterns shaded to a thin gold. The pool lay black and glassy, and about its rim the night pressed like a hand. There we saw prints again, long single rails where no deer track matched, and, close to the water, the impression of a face in the bank as if something had rested and watched. A clump of moss had been disturbed, and in its hollow lay a ring of pale sap, congealed like bile. We did not fire then. There were reasons: the risk of a stray bullet in oak country, the doubt of what exactly a shot would bring, and a certain primitive reluctance to burn down a thing that might be something human, however strange. We resolved instead to track until dawn, to take bearings and to walk the ridge where the country opened and we might better see. We tightened our straps, measured distance with the brass chain, and left one man with the horses. Before we set, I turned and looked back at the pool. In the lantern's reflection, a pale face hovered for a moment among the roots, eyes reflecting bright as the white of bone. It did not move, and then the dark swallowed it. We took up the deer run again, the compass in my hand, my journal a weight against my leg, footsteps counted in the falling dark. We pushed on with the knowledge that whatever we followed knew the country better than we did, and that the route we had chosen had become, for the time being, its road as well. We retreated to the village by lantern and cart, leaving behind the broken stake and an empty camp. The night pressed down with its damp, and the horses laboured through clay that sucked at their hooves. I remember steadying my dry plate camera beneath the leather hood and fumbling for the box of plates, cursing softly when one slid and fractured against the brass frame, an echo of the night's brittle business. The kerosene lanterns swung from the cart's yoke, casting a small pool of sulphurous light that showed nothing but tree trunks and fog. We rode in silence more eloquent than speech. The game warden with his cap pulled low, the younger foresters with their hands on their rifles, and me with my field notebook damp at the edges and a hurried sketch folded inside. At first light, we returned to the clearing to find only the stake splintered as if from some enormous, awkward hand. The campfire had long since curled to grey ash. The bed of pine boughs lay pressed and then smoothed, as though some creature had risen and gone with deliberation. The tracks were the most awkward testament, too long between heel and sole to be human, yet bearing fingernail-like marks across the softer earth. We measured them with the brass rule we always carried, made bearings upon my pocket compass, and recorded the direction the prints took into denser timber. Wind had erased, much only the underbrush held the story, and the story was not, in any comfortable sense, human. One forester would not look at us afterwards. He wrapped his wool greatcoat about his face and spoke only of the old wives' talk to himself when pressed, as if to keep something worse at bay. The game warden, his hands once so steady, handed me his resignation within a week. He said, in a voice stripped of the official scorn he had always managed for the superstitious, that his duties would no longer take him where the light failed. He kept also a small tally of the nights in a remembrance book, neatly crossed through, and he sent it with the resignation as if the act might render the thing manageable. I kept the hurried sketch I had made at the edge of the clearing, a shaky outline of a tall, pale figure half masked by fog, the suggestion of long arms, and below it my notes, measurements, smell, iron and wet moss, the ringing hollowness that had come from the trees when it stepped forward. The damaged glass plate survived the journey back in a patched case. When developed, it yielded no clear image, only a smear of pallid light where the figure might have been, and the greater clarity of fogged sky. In the plate, the light seemed to flatten the wood into something unreal, as if the forest itself had turned its face to the lens and refused to be known. We filed an official account with the Prussian Forestry Administration, dated October 1891, detailing the sighting, the tracks, our measurements, and the broken stake. The report was sober, composed with the care of men whose livelihoods depended on orderly forms and statistics. It offered no conclusion. A clerk recorded our notebooks into the archive, They sat beside more prosaic surveys of timber yield and game counts, a pale anomaly in the neat rows of ink. The villagers hardened their warnings into a small local legend. At the inn, I heard their voices at dusk, lower and quicker than before. They spoke of a pale forest man who watched with the patience of a sentinel, who could be coaxed by a lantern and then would not be coaxed away. They embroidered the tale with whatever fear their evenings supplied, and it clung to the place like a lichened growth upon stone. We left no sign of violence at the clearing, save for the splintered stake and our own shaken impressions. No man was taken in the manner of a tale we were not shredded, nor were there cries to wake the dawn. Our survival was practical, a matter of lanterns, boots, the compass that never abandoned true north, and the rigid, humiliating necessity of return. Yet the cost was counted otherwise: a man's resignation, a forester's silence, a damaged plate and a sketch that would not be explained. Those objects became the small reliquaries of doubt we carried back into ordinary lives. Years later, our notebooks rest in government drawers. The villagers still point to the patches of old growth and whisper. The pale forest man remains a quiet, unresolved notch upon the map of those woods, a mark I pass on in ink and in the memory of the lantern's thin light and in the fogged smear on glass that refuses to yield a face.